January 17, 1991. Baghdad, Iraq. A Soviet-trained Iraqi radar operator sat at his console, scanning the skies above the capital. His screen showed what it had shown for hours, nothing unusual. Commercial flights had been grounded. The airspace was clear. American warplanes were expected, but they weren't here yet. Then, without warning, the command center he was sitting in exploded. The blast came from nowhere. No warning. No radar contact. No missile alert. One moment, he was staring at an empty screen. The next, the building was collapsing around him. He survived by pure luck, pulling himself from rubble, ears ringing, completely disoriented. Similar scenes played out across Baghdad that night. Air Defense headquarters destroyed. Communications centers obliterated. Command bunkers struck with precision. 36 high-value targets hit in the opening minutes of Desert Storm. And Iraqi radar, the same Soviet-made systems that had defended the skies over North Vietnam and shot down countless aircraft, detected nothing. Not a single contact. Not one warning. The strikes came from aircraft that, as far as Iraqi defenses were concerned, simply didn't exist. They called it a ghost. A phantom. An impossibility. The Americans called it the F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth aircraft. But rewind a decade. The late 1980s. Soviet military journals published articles mocking the American obsession with invisible aircraft. One Soviet aerospace engineer wrote dismissively, "Stealth is a Western fantasy, a waste of resources. Physics cannot be cheated. Radar will always see aircraft." Western aviation magazines ridiculed leaked photos of an angular, bizarre-looking aircraft that resembled a flying diamond, more than a fighter jet. Critics called it the wobbling goblin, doubting it could even fly. The design violated every principle of aerodynamic efficiency. Even some American generals were skeptical. The F-117 cost $80 million per aircraft. It flew slower than many World War II fighters. It carried no guns, no air-to-air missiles, no defensive systems. Put it up against a Soviet interceptor in a dogfight, and it would be destroyed in seconds. But the F-117 wasn't designed for dogfights. It was designed to do something no aircraft in history had ever done: become functionally invisible to radar, penetrate the most sophisticated air defense networks ever built, and strike targets with impunity. The Soviets laughed at the concept. They dismissed the fuzzy photographs. They called it propaganda, disinformation, typical American exaggeration. And then one night in Panama, and another night in Baghdad, those laughs died in their throats. This is the story of how American engineers turned a Soviet scientist's obscure mathematical theory into a weapon that rendered decades of air defense technology obsolete. How a plane that looked like it couldn't fly changed warfare forever. And how the Soviet Union's own research gave America the tools to disappear from their radars. They called it impossible. The Americans built it anyway. To understand why stealth technology represented such a revolutionary breakthrough, you need to understand the Cold War arms race in the sky. From the 1950s through the 1980s, both superpowers were locked in a constant struggle for air superiority. The logic was simple. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the battlefield. Whoever could see enemy aircraft first, shoot first, and deny the enemy the ability to strike, would win any conflict. The United States built a series of increasingly sophisticated bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. The B-52 Stratofortress could carry nuclear weapons to targets deep inside the Soviet Union. The U-2 spy plane flew at 70,000 feet, above Soviet missiles. The State Route 71 Blackbird flew at Mach 3, faster than any interceptor or missile could catch. The Soviet response was equally sophisticated. They developed surface-to-air missile systems like the S-75 Dvina, which famously shot down Gary Powers' U-2 in 1960. They built interceptors like the MiG-25 Foxbat, capable of reaching 80,000 feet and Mach 2.8. They constructed a radar network that blanketed Soviet territory and Warsaw Pact nations, thousands of stations constantly scanning for Western aircraft. This created an endless cycle of measure and countermeasure. America built faster planes. The Soviets built faster missiles. America built higher-flying planes. The Soviets built missiles that could reach higher altitudes. America developed electronic countermeasures to jam Soviet radar. The Soviets developed new radar frequencies that couldn't be jammed. By the 1970s, both sides had reached the limits of speed and altitude. You could only fly so fast before aerodynamic heating destroyed your aircraft. You could only fly so high before you were essentially in space. The State Route 71 represented the ultimate expression of the go fast, go high philosophy, and even it was vulnerable to newer Soviet missile systems. American military planners faced a strategic problem. Soviet air defenses were improving faster than American penetration capabilities. Projections suggested that by the late 1980s, Soviet SAM networks would be dense enough and sophisticated enough to shoot down even the State Route 71. American bombers carrying nuclear weapons would be unable to reach their targets. The entire concept of strategic air power was becoming obsolete. The solution had to be radical. If you couldn't outrun radar and you couldn't fly above radar, maybe you could hide from radar entirely. The concept of reducing radar signature wasn't new. During World War II, German U-boats experimented with radar-absorbing coatings. In the 1950s, Lockheed had applied radar-absorbing materials to the U-2 to reduce its detectability. But these were minor reductions, tweaks around the edges. The radar cross-section would be smaller, but aircraft remained visible. What American aerospace engineers began contemplating in the early 1970s was fundamentally different, not reducing radar signature, but effectively eliminating it, creating an aircraft so invisible to radar that it might as well not exist. The technical challenges were staggering. Radar works by bouncing radio waves off objects and detecting the reflections. To make an aircraft invisible to radar, you needed to either absorb all the radio waves or reflect them in directions away from the receiver. Both seemed physically impossible given the size and metal content of aircraft. But a small team at Lockheed Skunk Works, the legendary division that had built the U-2 and State Route 71, believed it could be done. They weren't trying to build a faster plane or a higher flying plane. They were trying to build a plane that would simply vanish from enemy radar screens. The Soviets, watching American research efforts through espionage and satellite observation, saw reports of stealth research and dismissed it. Their radar scientists calculated that meaningful stealth was theoretically impossible. The Americans were wasting money on science fiction. What the Soviets didn't realize was that the key to making stealth work had been published in a Soviet journal years earlier by one of their own scientists, in a paper that Soviet military intelligence had completely ignored. The story begins with a Soviet scientist and an obscure mathematical paper that almost nobody read. In 1962, Pyotr Yefimtsev, a mathematician working at the Moscow Institute of Radio Engineering, published a paper titled Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. It was dense, theoretical, filled with complex equations about how electromagnetic waves behaved when they encountered edges and surfaces. The paper addressed a fundamental question in radar theory. When radar waves hit an object, how exactly do they scatter? Previous approaches used approximations. Yefimtsev developed precise mathematical methods for calculating radar reflection from specific geometric shapes. Soviet military analysts reviewed the paper and concluded it had no practical military application. It was theoretical physics, interesting to academics, but useless for actual weapons development. They allowed it to be published in the open scientific literature. In 1971, it was even translated into English and made available to Western researchers. This was one of the greatest intelligence failures in Soviet history. At Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California, an engineer named Dennis Overholzer came across Yefimtsev's translated paper in 1975. Overholzer was working on the seemingly impossible problem of stealth aircraft design. He'd been studying how to reduce radar cross-sections, but conventional approaches weren't working. Aircraft had curves, rounded surfaces, wings and tails and engines that all reflected radar in complex ways. Then he read Yefimtsev's equations and realized they provided the solution. Yefimtsev had shown mathematically how radar waves scattered off specific shapes. More importantly, he'd shown that certain geometric configurations could be designed to reflect radar energy in predictable directions, away from the source. If you could calculate exactly how radar bounced off every surface of an aircraft, you could design that aircraft to bounce radar anywhere except back toward the radar receiver. The catch: you couldn't use conventional aircraft shapes. Smooth curves and rounded surfaces scattered radar in unpredictable directions. To control radar reflection precisely, you needed flat surfaces at precise angles, facets, like a cut diamond. Overholser and a small team led by Ben Rich, who'd taken over Skunk Works after Kelly Johnson's retirement, began designing what would become known as the Hopeless Diamond. It looked nothing like an aircraft. It was a collection of flat panels arranged at angles that would deflect radar waves away from their source. It had sharp edges everywhere. No curves. No smooth transitions. It looked like something a child might build from cardboard. Aerodynamic engineers took one look at it and declared it unflyable. It violated every principle of aerodynamic design. The flat surfaces would create enormous drag. The sharp angles would generate unpredictable airflows. The whole thing would tumble out of control the moment it left the ground. But when the design was analyzed for radar cross-section using computers programmed with Yefimtsev's equations, the results were stunning. The Hopeless Diamond, despite being made of metal, would have a radar signature smaller than a large bird. To radar, it would essentially be invisible. The Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, funded the project codenamed Have Blue. 2 prototype aircraft were built in extreme secrecy and transported to Area 51, the remote Nevada test site used for classified aircraft development. The first test flight of Have Blue occurred on December 1, 1977. The aircraft flew. Barely. It was unstable, requiring constant computer-controlled adjustments to remain airborne. Pilots said it flew like balancing a bowling ball on top of a basketball. But it flew. More importantly, radar tests confirmed what the equations had predicted. Have Blue had a radar cross-section estimated at 0.003 square meters, about the size of a hummingbird. Conventional fighters had radar cross-sections of 10 to 15 square meters. Soviet bombers were 100 square meters or larger. Have Blue was effectively invisible. Both Have Blue prototypes crashed during testing. The design's inherent instability made it extremely difficult to fly. But the program proved stealth technology worked. In 1978, the Air Force authorized full development of an operational stealth aircraft, the F-117. Building the F-117 required solving enormous technical challenges. The aircraft needed to be stable enough for combat pilots to fly on operational missions. It needed to carry weapons internally. External bombs would ruin its stealth characteristics. It needed sophisticated navigation systems because it would fly at night, at low altitude, with no radar emissions that might reveal its position. Lockheed engineers refined the faceted design, adding more panels and optimizing angles to improve both stealth and aerodynamics. The result looked like a geometric nightmare, a black arrowhead covered in flat triangular panels, with sharp edges everywhere and a profile that seemed designed to maximize drag rather than minimize it. The F-117's official statistics were unimpressive. Top speed, 617 miles per hour, subsonic. Ceiling, 43,000 feet, lower than many conventional fighters. Range, 930 miles without refueling, requiring tanker support for long missions. Weapons capacity, 2 laser-guided bombs, far less than conventional attack aircraft. But one statistic mattered above all others. Radar cross-section of approximately 0.001 to 0.01 square meters, depending on the angle. To radar operators, an F-117 at 10 miles looked the same as a bird at 1 mile. Most radar systems were programmed to ignore contacts that small to reduce false alarms from birds and weather. The F-117 wouldn't show up on radar screens. It wouldn't trigger alarm systems. It would simply penetrate enemy airspace, strike its target, and disappear, leaving air defense operators staring at blank screens wondering what had just destroyed their command centers. Development was conducted under such tight security that even other Air Force units didn't know the program existed. The F-117 flew only at night from remote bases. When transported, it was covered in tarps. Workers signed documents swearing them to secrecy under penalty of prosecution. By 1983, the F-117 was operational. The jet that didn't exist was ready for war. Soviet intelligence knew the Americans were working on something called stealth technology. KGB agents had reported on research programs at Lockheed and Northrop. satellite reconnaissance detected unusual activity at Area 51. Signals intelligence intercepted communications using code names like Have Blue and Senior Trend. But Soviet aerospace engineers and military planners were skeptical, bordering on dismissive. In Moscow's aerospace research institutes, scientists analyzed the concept of radar-evading aircraft and concluded it was largely impossible. Radar had been refined over 4 decades into an extraordinarily sophisticated technology. Soviet radar networks could detect aircraft hundreds of miles away, track multiple targets simultaneously, and guide missiles with precision. A 1984 article in a Soviet military aviation journal declared, "The so-called stealth aircraft being developed by the Americans represents desperate measures by a declining imperial power. Physics cannot be manipulated by wishful thinking. Electromagnetic radiation will always reveal the presence of large metal objects." Claims of invisible aircraft belong in science fiction, not serious military analysis. This wasn't entirely wrong. Early Soviet assessments correctly identified that perfect invisibility was impossible. No aircraft could be truly undetectable. There were always some radar returns, infrared signatures from engines, visual detection at close range, acoustic signatures. But the Soviets made a critical error. They dismissed the possibility that radar cross-sections could be reduced enough to render existing radar networks ineffective. They couldn't imagine an aircraft with a signature so small that it would be filtered out as noise by automatic detection systems. Soviet air defense doctrine was built on radar superiority. They'd invested billions in the PVO Streny, the Soviet Air Defense Force, creating overlapping radar coverage across the entire Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact territories. They had early warning radars for long-range detection, tracking radars for following aircraft, and fire control radars for guiding missiles. This system was designed to detect and destroy American bombers carrying nuclear weapons. It was the Soviet Union's primary defense against nuclear attack. The idea that this entire system could be rendered obsolete by aircraft design was unthinkable, so they didn't think it. When blurry photographs of an angular, bizarre-looking aircraft began appearing in Western aviation magazines in the mid-1980s, Soviet analysts studied them carefully. The design looked aerodynamically unsound. The flat surfaces and sharp edges would create tremendous drag. The lack of curved surfaces would make the aircraft unstable. One Soviet aerodynamicist, reviewing the leaked photos, commented, "If this is the American stealth aircraft, they've sacrificed every principle of aircraft design to chase a radar reduction that won't work in practice. This aircraft will be slow, unstable, and vulnerable. Our MiG-29s will destroy it easily in air combat." Western aviation journalists were equally skeptical. Articles in trade publications mocked the F-117's appearance when it was finally acknowledged in 1988. "The flying doorstop," one headline read. "Ugly and ungainly," declared another. Aviation Week and Space Technology, the industry's most respected publication, ran pieces questioning whether the enormous cost, estimated at over $2 billion for the program, could be justified for an aircraft with such limited performance. Even within the U.S. military, skepticism persisted. The F-117 had no defensive weapons. If detected, it couldn't fight back. It couldn't dogfight. It couldn't defend itself. Conventional Air Force doctrine emphasized speed, maneuverability, and firepower. The F-117 had none of these. Critics argued that electronic countermeasures and standoff weapons made more sense than stealth. Why waste billions on a strange-looking aircraft when you could jam enemy radar or launch missiles from outside detection range? The F-117 program's extreme secrecy made defending it difficult. Proponents couldn't explain its capabilities without revealing classified information. They couldn't show radar tests proving its effectiveness. They couldn't describe operational concepts that would demonstrate its revolutionary potential. So the mockery continued. Soviet propaganda featured cartoons of peculiar angular aircraft being easily shot down by Soviet missiles. Western critics published articles questioning Pentagon spending priorities. Even pilots trained on the F-117 weren't allowed to tell their families what they flew. The doubters had logic, aerodynamic theory, and common sense on their side. What they didn't have was experience with what the F-117 could actually do. That experience would come soon enough. and it would silence the laughter permanently. October 1983. Tonopah Test Range, Nevada. A remote airbase in the desert, surrounded by restricted airspace, protected by security protocols that made Area 51 look accessible. The first operational F-117 Squadron, the 4,450th Tactical Group, began flying combat-ready missions. Officially, the unit didn't exist. The aircraft they flew weren't in any Air Force inventory. The missions they trained for were classified at levels requiring special clearances beyond top secret. 59 F-117s were eventually built. Each cost approximately $42 million in 1986 dollars, over $100 million in today's money. The entire program cost exceeded $6 billion. This made the F-117 one of the most expensive aircraft ever developed, pound for pound. The aircraft operated under restrictions unlike any other military plane. All flights occurred at night. Pilots took off after dark, conducted training missions in restricted airspace, and landed before dawn. During daytime, the F-117s were hidden in specially built hangars with guards posted continuously. When maintenance required moving aircraft outside, they were immediately covered with tarps. Satellite overpass schedules were tracked carefully. Soviet reconnaissance satellites were predictable, and aircraft were moved only when satellites weren't overhead. Pilots selected for F-117 duty underwent extensive background checks and psychological evaluations. They signed non-disclosure agreements that threatened decades in prison for revealing program details. They couldn't tell their families what they flew. When asked, they claimed to fly a 7 Corsair attack aircraft, a cover story maintained through paperwork and false flight logs. The operational concept was unlike anything in Air Force doctrine. The F-117 would penetrate enemy airspace alone, at night, with no fighter escort, no electronic jamming support, no defensive weapons. It relied entirely on stealth for survival. The aircraft carried laser-guided bombs internally. Attack profiles were precisely planned. Approach at low altitude using terrain masking. Climb briefly to acquire the target with forward-looking infrared sensors. Guide the bomb to impact using a laser designator. Then descend and egress at low altitude. Training missions simulated strikes against Soviet targets. Pilots memorized routes, practiced emergency procedures, and learned to trust their aircraft's ability to remain invisible. This required psychological adjustment. Conventional pilots relied on situational awareness of threats. F-117 pilots had to accept that they wouldn't see threats on radar because threats wouldn't see them. Soviet intelligence suspected the F-117 existed but couldn't confirm details. Satellite photos showed unusual triangular shapes at Tonopah, but resolution wasn't sufficient for technical analysis. KGB agents tried recruiting Lockheed employees, but security was too tight. Signals intelligence detected unusual communications patterns, but couldn't decipher the content. In November 1988, after 5 years of operational secrecy, the Pentagon held a press conference. Assistant Secretary of Defense J. Daniel Howard stood before cameras and made an announcement. The Air Force has an operational stealth aircraft. It's called the F-117A. It's been flying for several years. One grainy photograph was released, showing a dark angular aircraft from a distance. No technical details. No performance specifications. No explanation of how stealth technology worked. Just confirmation that the rumors were true. America had built an invisible airplane. Soviet aerospace engineers scrambled to analyze the photograph. They confirmed their earlier assessment that the design was aerodynamically unsound. The flat surfaces and sharp angles would create drag and instability. But they also had to confront an uncomfortable reality. The Americans had actually built this thing and were operating it. But information remained scarce. The U.S. maintained strict operational security. F-117 pilots still flew only at night. The aircraft remained hidden during daylight. Deployments to overseas bases were conducted under cover of darkness. Then in December 1989, the F-117 flew its first combat mission. The target was Panama. The mission: strike a Panamanian Defense Force barracks as part of Operation Just Cause. The results were mixed. The bombs missed their intended targets due to poor intelligence about exact building locations. But the F-117s had penetrated Panamanian airspace undetected, struck targets, and egressed without being engaged by air defenses. It was a limited operation against a minor adversary, but it proved the concept. Stealth aircraft could conduct combat operations in hostile airspace. The F-117 wasn't theoretical anymore. It was operational, and it was about to prove just how revolutionary it truly was. January 17, 1991, 2:38 a.m. Baghdad time. Operation Desert Storm began. 42 F-117 Nighthawks from the 37th and 415th Tactical Fighter Wings launched from King Khalid Air Base in Saudi Arabia, part of a massive coalition air campaign involving over 1,000 aircraft. But the F-117s had a special mission: strike Baghdad's most heavily defended targets during the opening hours of the war. Iraq's air defense network was formidable. It had more air defense weapons than any country except the Soviet Union itself. Coalition planners identified high-value targets that had to be destroyed immediately: air defense command centers, communications facilities, government bunkers, presidential palaces. These targets were in downtown Baghdad, protected by overlapping radar coverage and dense SAM sites. Conventional aircraft would face devastating losses attacking these targets. Even with electronic jamming and anti-radiation missiles to suppress air defenses, casualty projections suggested dozens of aircraft would be shot down in the opening nights. The F-117s would strike these targets first, before air defenses were alerted, using their stealth to achieve complete surprise. Each F-117 carried 2 GBU, 27 paveway, 3 laser-guided bombs, 2,000-pound weapons capable of penetrating hardened bunkers. Flight routes were carefully planned to avoid known SAM sites while maintaining low altitude to exploit terrain masking. Pilots flew with night vision goggles, navigating by GPS and inertial guidance systems. The first F-117 over Baghdad approached the city at approximately 2:50 a.m. Iraqi radar operators saw nothing unusual. The aircraft appeared as nothing. Background noise. A glitch in the system perhaps. Certainly not an aircraft. The F-117 climbed to attack altitude, its targeting system locking onto an air defense command center. The laser designated the target. The bomb released, guided by reflected laser energy. 20 seconds later, the command center exploded. All across Baghdad, this scene repeated. F-117s appeared from nowhere, struck targets with precision, and vanished. Air defense radars showed nothing. No warnings, no tracks, no missile launches. Just explosions. One Iraqi radar operator survived the destruction of his facility and later described the experience. Our screens were clear. Then the building shook and everything went dark. We had no idea what hit us. No missile alert, no aircraft warning. It was like being struck by lightning from a clear sky. Within the first hour of Desert Storm, F-117s destroyed 31 high-value targets in Baghdad. They struck with remarkable precision. Bombs hit their designated targets within meters. Hardened bunkers were penetrated. Communications centers were leveled. Command and control networks were severed. And Iraqi air defenses fired blindly into empty sky, unable to detect the attackers. Over the next 43 days of the air campaign, F-117s flew nearly 1,300 sorties. They struck 1,600 high-value targets. Despite flying into the most heavily defended airspace in Iraq, not a single F-117 was shot down. Not one was even damaged by enemy fire. This represented 1% of all coalition aircraft, but they struck 40% of strategic targets. The ratio of effectiveness to aircraft numbers was unprecedented in military aviation history. American pilots called Desert Storm the turkey shoot because Iraqi aircraft were so outmatched. F-117 pilots had an even easier war. They flew into hostile airspace as if it were empty, struck targets at will, and returned to base for breakfast. The most dangerous part of their missions was aerial refueling, dodging tanker aircraft in crowded airspace. Soviet military observers stationed with Iraq analyzed the campaign with growing alarm. They recognized the implications immediately. Soviet air defense doctrine, equipment, and training had proven completely ineffective against stealth aircraft. Radar systems worth billions of rubles detected nothing. SAM systems never launched. Iraqi forces using Soviet tactics were blind to the attack. This wasn't a failure of Iraqi training or readiness. This was a fundamental obsolescence of the entire Soviet approach to air defense. Radar superiority, the foundation of Soviet strategy for 4 decades, had been rendered meaningless. Worse, from the Soviet perspective, was the realization that the F-117 was just the beginning. If America could make attack aircraft invisible to radar, they could do the same with bombers, cruise missiles, reconnaissance planes. The entire Soviet air defense network, from radar stations to missile batteries to interceptor aircraft, might be obsolete. The laughter that had greeted American stealth programs in the 1980s was replaced by grim silence. The Americans hadn't just built an invisible airplane. They'd redefined the nature of air warfare itself. Moscow, January 1991. While F-117s were devastating Baghdad, Soviet aerospace engineers and military planners gathered in emergency sessions to assess the implications. The conclusions were sobering. Everything Soviet air defense strategy was built on, radar networks, surface-to-air missiles, interceptor aircraft, had been designed to counter conventional aircraft. Stealth technology rendered these systems largely ineffective. Soviet radar engineers went back to fundamental physics. They retrieved Pyotr Yefimtsev's original papers from archives and studied them with new urgency. The irony was painful. A Soviet scientist had published the theoretical foundation for stealth in 1962. Soviet military intelligence had dismissed it as impractical. American engineers had used it to build the F-117. "We gave them the key," one Soviet radar scientist later admitted in an interview. Yefimtsev's mathematics showed exactly how to design aircraft that would evade our radars. We published it openly. The Americans read it and understood its implications. We didn't. Soviet research into counter-stealth technologies accelerated dramatically. Engineers explored several approaches to detecting low-observable aircraft. Low-frequency radar. Stealth aircraft were optimized to evade high-frequency radars used by most air defense systems. Lower frequencies, particularly VHF and UHF bands, produced longer wavelengths that might detect stealth aircraft. The drawback: low-frequency radar couldn't provide accurate targeting data for missiles. Bistatic radar. Conventional radar sent signals and received reflections at the same location. Bistatic systems separated transmitter and receiver, making it harder for stealth aircraft to direct reflections away from both simultaneously. But bistatic systems were complex and expensive. Infrared detection. Jet engines produced heat signatures that stealth shaping couldn't hide. But infrared systems had limited range and were affected by weather conditions. Acoustic detection. Aircraft produced noise from engines and airframe. Acoustic sensors might detect stealth aircraft at close range. But effective range was measured in kilometers, far too short for strategic warning. Each approach had limitations. Most provided only general detection. Something is out there somewhere. Not the precise targeting data needed to guide missiles. And all required massive investment to develop and deploy at scale. The Soviet Union in 1991 didn't have massive resources to invest. The economy was collapsing. The Communist Party was losing power. Mikhail Gorbachev was desperately trying to hold the country together through reforms. Defense spending was being slashed, not increased. Proposals for new stealth detection systems competed with proposals for stealth aircraft development. Soviet aerospace designers drafted concepts for low-observable aircraft, projects like the MiG-37 Ferret and stealthy variants of the Su-47. But these remained paper studies, lacking funding for prototypes. By December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved entirely. The Russian Federation inherited Soviet military technology, but not Soviet military budgets. Programs to counter or develop stealth technology were suspended or canceled. Brain drain accelerated as engineers emigrated or joined private industry. The technological gap between American and Russian stealth capabilities widened dramatically throughout the 1990s. America developed the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber and began designing next-generation fighters. Russia struggled to maintain existing conventional forces. It wasn't until the 2000s, with Russia's economy recovering under Vladimir Putin, that serious investment in counter-stealth technology resumed. Systems like the Nebo SVU radar, designed specifically to detect low observable aircraft using VHF frequencies, entered service. The S-400 missile system incorporated multiple radar frequencies to improve detection probability against stealth targets. But these systems couldn't reclaim the technological superiority Soviet air defenses had once enjoyed. They might detect stealth aircraft under certain conditions, at certain ranges, with enough warning to scramble interceptors. But they couldn't provide the reliable, comprehensive coverage that Soviet planners had assumed would always be available. More significantly, American stealth technology continued advancing. The F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II represented second- and third-generation stealth designs, incorporating lessons from the F-117. They featured improved shaping, radar-absorbing materials, and sophisticated electronic warfare systems. Their radar cross-sections were even smaller than the F-117's. The F-117 had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Invisibility to radar wasn't theoretical anymore. It was operational, and every major military power was now pursuing it. Pyotr Yakovlevich Yefimtsev was born in 1931 in the Ural Mountains region of the Soviet Union. He studied mathematics and physics, specializing in electromagnetic theory and diffraction. His career was spent in Soviet research institutes, working on theoretical problems in radiophysics. In 1962, when Yefimtsev published Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction, he was a mid-level researcher, unknown outside specialist circles. His paper addressed mathematical questions about how electromagnetic waves scattered from edges and surfaces. It was pure theory, divorced from practical applications, or so it seemed. Soviet military reviewers examined the paper and classified it as not militarily significant. It could be published openly without compromising national security. This assessment was catastrophically wrong, but understandable given the context. Yefimtsev's equations were complex, his examples were theoretical, and practical applications weren't obvious. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, as American engineers used his mathematics to design stealth aircraft, Yefimtsev continued his career in Soviet research institutes. He published additional papers on electromagnetic theory. He trained graduate students. He had no idea his work was revolutionizing military aviation on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Like many Soviet scientists, Yefimtsev found himself in an uncertain position. Research funding collapsed. Institutes closed or reorganized. Salaries weren't paid for months. Many scientists emigrated, seeking opportunities in the West. In 1990, Yefimtsev emigrated to the United States. He joined the faculty at the University of California, Los Angeles, teaching electromagnetics and continuing his research. Only then did he fully understand how his theoretical work had been applied. American engineers who'd worked on the F-117 program sought him out, thanking him for his contributions. Lockheed engineers told him his mathematics had been fundamental to stealth aircraft design. Without his equations, the F-117 might never have existed. Yefimtsev's reaction was mixed. He was proud that his theoretical work had found practical application. But he was also disturbed that his research, intended for peaceful scientific purposes, had been weaponized. And there was profound irony in the fact that his Soviet paper had enabled an American weapon system designed to penetrate Soviet defenses. "I never imagined my work would be used this way," Yefimtsev said in a 1994 interview. "In the Soviet Union, we believed this kind of research was theoretical, with no immediate practical application. The Americans saw what we missed, that these equations could guide aircraft design." He continued teaching and researching at UCLA until his retirement. His later work focused on electromagnetic scattering and diffraction theory, expanding the mathematical framework he'd begun developing in the 1960s. But he would always be remembered primarily for the paper that changed military aviation. In interviews, Yefimtsev was asked repeatedly about his feelings regarding the F-117. Did he feel regret that Soviet military analysts had dismissed his work? Was he angry that Americans had benefited from Soviet research? Did he feel responsible for the aircraft's use in combat? His answers were consistently thoughtful and nuanced. He expressed no bitterness about Soviet military intelligence overlooking his work. Science advances when information is shared, he said. Secrecy slows progress. The Americans succeeded partly because they were willing to examine research from any source, even from their adversaries. He noted that the Cold War created artificial barriers to scientific collaboration. Soviet and American scientists working on similar problems couldn't communicate or share findings. This hindered both sides. The F-117 succeeded partly because American engineers were pragmatic enough to use Soviet theoretical research despite political tensions. The broader irony extended beyond one man's mathematical paper. Throughout the Cold War, both superpowers conducted extensive espionage to steal each other's military secrets. Billions were spent on intelligence operations. Yet one of the most significant technological breakthroughs of the era came from a paper published openly in scientific journals. The Soviet system had failed not through lack of information, but through inability to recognize the significance of information it already possessed. The paper was there, available to Soviet military researchers. The mathematics was sound. The implications for radar cross-section reduction were present in the equations. But Soviet aerospace doctrine was wedded to traditional approaches: faster aircraft, higher-flying aircraft, more powerful engines. The radical concept of designing aircraft geometry specifically to evade radar didn't fit existing paradigms. So it was dismissed. American engineers, perhaps more willing to consider unconventional approaches, or perhaps simply desperate for solutions to the Soviet air defense challenge, recognized Yefimtsev's mathematics as a blueprint for stealth. This pattern, breakthrough innovation coming from unexpected sources, recurred throughout Cold War technological competition. Soviet scientists developed crucial concepts that Americans implemented. American research sometimes inspired Soviet innovations. Science crossed ideological boundaries more easily than politicians imagined. Yefimtsev spent his later years reflecting on the relationship between science and military application. He never expressed regret about his research. Scientific knowledge, he argued, was inherently neutral. How it was used reflected human choices, not mathematical inevitability. I studied electromagnetic waves, he said. What others did with that knowledge, building stealth aircraft or learning to detect them, was their choice. Science gives us tools. We decide whether to build or destroy. Pyotr Yefimtsev died in 2013 at age 82 in Los Angeles, far from the Soviet research institutes where he developed the mathematics that made modern stealth aircraft possible. His obituaries appeared in scientific journals worldwide, noting his contributions to electromagnetic theory and, inevitably, his unintentional role in creating the F-117. The man who gave the world stealth technology never sought recognition for it. He was a mathematician who'd solved interesting equations. That his equations enabled aircraft to become invisible was someone else's idea, a brilliant application he'd never imagined. The F-117 Nighthawk flew operationally for 27 years, from 1983 to 2008. During that time, it fundamentally changed air warfare and sparked a revolution in military technology that continues today. Its combat record was extraordinary. Beyond Desert Storm, F-117s flew missions in Yugoslavia during Operation Allied Force in 1999, striking targets in Belgrade despite Serbian air defenses. They operated over Afghanistan and Iraq during the post-9/11 wars. Over its entire operational lifetime, the F-117 flew thousands of combat missions. Only one F-117 was ever shot down in combat. On March 27, 1999, during the Kosovo War, a Serbian air defense unit using an SA-3 missile system managed to shoot down an F-117 piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko. Zelko ejected and was rescued. The shoot-down was attributed to a combination of factors. The F-117's bomb bay doors were open, temporarily increasing its radar signature, and Serbian forces had learned to detect the aircraft using modified radar techniques and careful observation of flight patterns. That single loss in thousands of combat sorties represented a success rate unmatched by any other combat aircraft in history. For comparison, during Vietnam, The U.S. lost over 900 aircraft to enemy action in a similar number of sorties. In 2008, the Air Force officially retired the F-117. The decision was practical. The aircraft was expensive to maintain. Its stealth coatings required constant reapplication, and newer stealth aircraft with superior capabilities were entering service. The F-22 Raptor, with stealth, supersonic speed, and air-to-air combat capability, represented a next-generation approach that made the F-117's limitations obsolete. But the F-117's true legacy isn't its operational record. It's the technological revolution it sparked. Every major military power now develops stealth aircraft. The United States operates the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, the F-22 Raptor, and the F-35 Lightning II, which is being sold to allied nations worldwide. Russia has developed the Su-57 fighter with stealth characteristics. China operates the J-20 and is developing additional stealth aircraft. Stealth technology has proliferated beyond aircraft. The U.S. Navy's Zumwalt-class destroyers incorporate stealth shaping to reduce radar signature. Cruise missiles are designed with low observable characteristics. Even tanks and ground vehicles now consider radar signature reduction in their designs. The principles developed for the F-117, faceted surfaces, radar-absorbing materials, emissions control, have become standard considerations in military vehicle design. Every new weapons system asks, how do we reduce detectability? This has sparked a parallel revolution in detection technology. Modern air defense systems use multiple radar frequencies, infrared sensors, and sophisticated signal processing to detect low observable aircraft. Russia's S-400 and S-500 missile systems specifically incorporate counter-stealth capabilities. China has developed long-wavelength radar systems designed to detect stealth aircraft at extended ranges. The result is a new technological arms race. Aircraft designers work to reduce radar signatures. Radar engineers work to detect smaller signatures. Each advance prompts counter-advances. The cycle continues, driving innovation on both sides. But stealth technology's impact extends beyond military applications. Research into radar-absorbing materials has found civilian uses. Techniques for reducing electromagnetic signatures have been applied to cellular communications and wireless networks. The computational methods used to calculate radar cross-sections have been adapted for other engineering challenges. The F-117 program also demonstrated that revolutionary capabilities could be developed and deployed in secrecy. For 5 years, from 1983 to 1988, the Air Force operated an entirely new class of aircraft that neither allies nor adversaries knew existed. This set a precedent for classified weapons development that continues today. How many classified programs are currently operational that we won't know about for decades? Perhaps the most enduring legacy is psychological. The F-117 proved that fundamental assumptions about warfare could be overturned through technology. For 40 years, everyone assumed that aircraft would always be visible to radar. The F-117 demonstrated that assumption was wrong. This changed how military planners think about the future. If aircraft can become invisible to radar, what other military constants might be overturned? The F-117 encouraged creative thinking about problems previously considered unsolvable. Today, some retired F-117s sit in museums. Their black angular forms fascinating visitors who remember when these aircraft were classified secrets. Others remain in storage at Tonopah, theoretically retired but maintained in flyable condition, suggesting that perhaps the Air Force isn't entirely finished with the stealth pioneer. For aviation enthusiasts, the F-117 represents a unique moment when science fiction became reality. An aircraft that looked like it shouldn't fly, that defied conventional design principles, that operated in absolute secrecy, and that changed warfare forever. The ghost had materialized, struck, and changed everything. Even in retirement, its shadow looms over modern military aviation, a reminder that the impossible sometimes just requires better mathematics and bold engineering. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, a black triangular shape sits in a climate-controlled hangar. It's been officially retired for years, but the aircraft is maintained in flyable condition, its systems periodically tested, its stealth coatings refreshed. This is one of the remaining F-117 Nighthawks, supposedly mothballed, but kept ready for reasons the Air Force won't publicly discuss. Perhaps as testbeds for new technologies. Perhaps as emergency backup should newer stealth aircraft face unexpected problems. Perhaps simply because disposing of highly classified aircraft is complicated. The F-117's retirement isn't really an ending. It's a transition. The aircraft that pioneered operational stealth has been succeeded by more capable platforms, but the principles it proved remain fundamental to modern air warfare. Look at any contemporary military aircraft, and you'll see the F-117's influence. Smooth curves have replaced the original's faceted surfaces. Modern computational methods can optimize stealth without such dramatic angles. But the basic approach remains. Shape the aircraft to control radar reflections, apply absorbing materials, minimize emissions that might reveal position. The F-35 Lightning II, now being produced in the hundreds for the U.S. and Allied Air Forces, represents the F-117's true legacy. It combines stealth with supersonic speed, advanced sensors, and network connectivity. It's everything the F-117 couldn't be: agile, versatile, multi-role, while maintaining the invisibility that made the original revolutionary. But stealth's future is uncertain. Advances in radar technology, particularly long-wavelength systems and sophisticated signal processing, are making detection of low observable aircraft more feasible. Infrared search and track systems can detect stealth aircraft's heat signatures. Improved computing allows air defense networks to piece together fragmentary data from multiple sensors. The era of complete invisibility may be passing. The future might belong to aircraft that are difficult to detect and track rather than impossible to detect. The arms race continues, measure and countermeasure, stealth and counter-stealth, in endless technological competition. What remains undeniable is that the F-117 changed military aviation permanently. It proved that revolutionary capabilities could emerge from unconventional thinking and willingness to challenge assumptions. It demonstrated that secrecy could be maintained even in the modern era. It showed that theoretical mathematics could have profound practical applications. And it taught a lesson about hubris. The Soviets laughed at American stealth programs, confident their radar technology was insurmountable. They dismissed reports of invisible aircraft as propaganda. They overlooked their own scientists' research that made it possible. By the time they understood their mistake, F-117s were striking Baghdad with impunity, rendering decades of air defense investment obsolete. The Americans built what others said was impossible. They made aircraft vanish from radar screens. They turned science fiction into operational reality. And for a few years, in the final decade of the Cold War, they possessed a capability that gave them an almost mystical advantage. The power to strike without being seen, to appear without warning, to disappear without trace. The age of stealth had begun, and it began with a flying diamond that everyone said would never work.